Good afternoon. Welcome to Respectability webinar for Wednesday, October 9th, 2019. Thank you for joining us today. Every October marks National Disability Employment Awareness Month, known as NDEAM, an opportunity for business leaders, community advocates, and service professionals to reflect on how to get more people with disabilities into the workforce. This year's theme, as announced by the Department of Labor, is the right talent right now. For years, James Emmett has been on the forefront of promising practices and proven strategies for getting more and more people with disabilities jobs. Join us on Wednesday, October 9th for a special conversation where James will share key insights from his trailblazing work in the private sector. Learn from him about talking an integrated approach to recruitment, accommodations, and promotion to structure the workplace for the long-term success of employees with disabilities. About our speaker, the James Emmett brand is one of the most recognizable in the field of disability inclusion. He is currently the lead strategist of the Workplace Initiative for the Poses Family Foundation, where he oversees strategy development and implementation of projects that impact the area of disability inclusion. James has worked on many of the most visible disability and inclusion projects in the country with companies like Walgreens, Best Buy, Office Depot Max, PepsiCo, and Mercy Health. Working through Advocacy, HR Connect, James serves as lead consultant for TIA Crest Roots of Employment Project. Also in partnership with the West Suburban Chamber of Commerce and Industry. James helped develop and narrated a video entitled Improving Customer Services for People with Disability, which has been viewed over 18,000 times on YouTube. James?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Respectability team. And it's a pleasure to be here. Happy NDEAM, as we would say, right? Happy National Disability Employment Awareness Month to everybody on, and thank you for taking some time to join us. What we're going to do today is we're going to take a little bit of a different perspective, hopefully, than some of the webinars that you've been on, especially maybe during this month, especially for our business folks out there that talk about introduction to disability inclusion. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disability inclusion best practices, and then we're going to talk in the second section about thinking about how you structure your workplace for long-term success for people with disabilities and how you actively build individuals with disabilities into your overall workplace culture. But I also think that hopefully by the end of this and what we will talk about, a lot of the employers who have engaged in this journey have found that when you build a culture for disability inclusion, you just build a more kind of accommodating workplace for everybody, for all learners, for all your employees. So we're going to talk about that long-term success, right, and move away from some of the introduction pieces that you may have been hearing and talk about how your company, from a long-term perspective, can win related to disability inclusion. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Like I said, section 1, we're going to review some best practices, some lessons learned from companies who have been experienced or who are some of the forefounders related to disability inclusion. And then when we get to section 2, we're going to talk specifically about workplace supports and how we build workplace supports to naturally support individuals with different types of disabilities. Okay. So a little bit about me. As I said, my name is James Emmett. I am the owner of James Emmett and Company, and I'm proud to have several members. We are a family-owned business, as kind of some of the bullet points talk to. We work with companies to help them build disability inclusion initiatives. We also work with a variety of nonprofit organizations out there to help them improve their business services as they go ahead and want to partner more with companies. This slide talks about some of the brands that I've had the opportunity to be a part of building their disability inclusion efforts, right? From Walgreens to Office Depot, Office Max, PepsiCo, Mercy Health, Best Buy, Cintas, TIAA. I'm proud now to be engaged in partnership with Autism Speaks with Michaels, the craft store, and with the ARC, and we're working with Advanced Auto. So a lot of companies, right? So many companies, and I know a lot of companies that are joining us today have begun or are thinking about beginning your disability inclusion effort. And I think what is such an exciting thing for so many of the companies that I've worked with, and I think so many of the companies out there, is that you have hired people with disabilities for a very long time, right? As long as your company has been in existence, you have hired people with disabilities because people with disabilities are out there in the workforce. But for many companies, this is the first time in history where you are building disability inclusion into your strategic approach to labor, to talent, and to culture and diversity and inclusion. And I think this is just such an amazing time in history in terms of how companies and the private sector are thinking about including people with disabilities on a strategic and active basis. And so that I think is really, it's a great time to be talking about, okay, not only how do we establish our initiative, but how do we build our initiative, a disability inclusion initiative for long-term success. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to point out, and I don't think this study that's on your screen right now gets enough attention. For me, when you think about the business case, right? So again, for those of you who are on the webinar, who your company is new to disability inclusion, or maybe you're selling it up the chain, right, in terms of some of your leaders and why your company should be doing this. This study that was, and this is a slide that summarizes a landmark study that was done in 2012 by the Society for Safety Engineers and published in Safety Management Journal. But basically what the Society for Safety Engineers did was take a hard look in collaboration with Walgreens, and many of you know that probably Walgreens, I had the opportunity to work with Randy Lewis. Walgreens was one of the, kind of founders, one of the first companies to doing disability inclusion in a scalable way. But in 2012, the Society for Safety Engineers came to Walgreens and said, let's look at business case, right? Let's look at, does this make sense? Does disability inclusion make sense from a business perspective? And so for those of you who haven't seen the results of this study or read that article, they're up here on your slide, right? So our left box, you will see that, and right, the green bars represent people with disabilities, and the blue bars represent people who had not disclosed with a disability. And what you see right on the far left is that people with disabilities who had disclosed with disabilities in the Walgreens distribution centers had about equal productivity to their counterparts. Maybe a tick higher depending on the position, but we'll just call it equal productivity. But we'll then look at that middle box, right? Look at the middle box. What Walgreens found is that people with disabilities turned over 48% less. So almost 50% less turnover from folks who disclosed with disabilities compared to those who did not. And I think when you ask a lot of the other companies who have begun to build strategic disability inclusion, what they will say is one of the benefits of doing this is finding brand loyal employees, right? Employees that especially, right, in this labor market, so tight, record low unemployment, hard to find talent. right? Individuals with disabilities are an amazing source of talent that are also going to stay with your company, and Walgreens demonstrated that, and many companies are replicating that result nowadays. And then one of the stigmas that I think is out there, and honestly my company spends a lot of time in the distribution and manufacturing industries, one of the things we hear a lot is, will people with disabilities get hurt more than, we have a busy environment, we have forklifts, and we have, the production lines moving really fast. Will people with disabilities get hurt more? And what Walgreens found, and I think what a lot of the companies we work with find, is that people with disabilities are as safe and sometimes safer. And that the box on the far right shows that people with disabilities actually had a third less, 33% less, workers' comp reportable incidents compared to those without disabilities. So the summary, right, the business case summary, if you're saying why should we be doing this in a scalable way in my company, well, that's the answer. Equal productivity, more brand loyal employees, reduced turnover, and either as safe or safer workers than other populations. Okay. All right. Think about disability inclusion, and I want to make sure that it's clear up front that when I say disability inclusion, I mean disability efforts that are owned by the company, right, that build into and under your brand as a company. That's the definition, that's my definition of disability inclusion, that these are company-owned efforts. And yes, for you all who are providers on the phone, right, it's really important that we play that supporting role, that development role to help companies build their disability inclusion. But at the end of the day, what we want are for companies to be able to build their specific disability inclusion efforts under their brand. So again, when we think about long-term sustainability of a disability inclusion project, what are some of the things that some of the past companies have done when you say, okay, so I get it, company-owned disability efforts, what are some of the things that we do? Well, first and foremost, training, right? Training based on introduction to disability awareness or addressing fear and stigma. Those are key parts of what a lot of companies have done systematically in the past, building disability-focused training into their learning management systems, that type of thing. Human resource mentoring, right? Being able to coach HR individuals on how for them to become the experts to be able to recruit, be able to screen, to be able to hire and onboard, and then train folks with disabilities, right? And being able to provide that mentoring as disability experts is a key part of that long-term sustainability. Being able to build those recruiting, screening, and training supports, right? Many of you on the call are using applicant tracking systems, right? And more and more of you on the call are going into the world of artificial intelligence and AI to help you with making those screening decisions of your candidates in general. But one of the things I ask you to think about is the accessibility of those systems, right? Can somebody who's deaf, or can somebody who's blind, or can a job seeker with an intellectual disability fairly access all the components of your applicant tracking system? And will fair decisions be made as part of that? For example, if somebody who has a history of mental health issues, if they maybe have a certain gap in their resume and it's explainable as related to their disability and great skills, will they be automatically screened out because of that gap? And how do we address those issues? So being able to support companies on that is another part of what past projects have looked at. One of the other things is building solid job accommodation, right? Making sure that we as companies have job accommodation processes, and we're going to talk a lot in the back end of this presentation about building what I call natural supports, or building, again, the workplace to help, ideas to help support employees with disabilities in the long term. Other parts of disability inclusion, other things that have been a part of projects, accessing incentives, right? The next bullet point talks about on-the-job training. There's a lot of on-the-job training dollars out there available through our good partners in vocational rehabilitation or workforce development. There are tax credits. You clearly, as a company, aren't doing this because of those incentives, but if you can access some of those incentives to help justify business case, I think that's great, right? Being able to provide coaching, right, and be able to coach folks on the job and be able to mentor is also part of past projects. And then thinking about messaging and marketing, right, both to your internal employees and being able to think about that customer market of people with disabilities. They're all things, when we say, what is disability inclusion, these efforts have been part of other companies who have built their disability inclusion efforts. Okay. And so when you ask those companies who are more experienced in disability inclusion, what have been some of the keys to success, or what do you see as the keys to your long-term sustainability of your disability inclusion efforts? So this is a list. So we start with making sure that there's a visible champion, right? And what I've learned in working with companies, you have to hopefully have a visible champion or set of champions at the C-suite level, right? At the leadership level. There's hopefully high-level buy-in to doing a disability inclusion effort. But one of the things that we've also learned at Walgreens and many of the other companies that we've partnered with is not only is that C-suite level buy-in important, it's really important that we get the buy-in of on-the-ground supervisors and managers, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the relationship between the employee with the disability and the supervisor that is going to make or break your initiative. And so getting that buy-in and intentionally creating a strategy around what's in this for supervisors at the local level is really an important part of what I think companies would say has worked from the past. Number 3, focus on business case, right? This is, if you do disability inclusion in the right way, folks, it's not about charity. It's not about you being a nice company. I mean, there's so many great companies out there. But at the end of the day, this has to be about return on investment. And if you don't demonstrate, right, and one of the things so many companies would tell you, again, for those companies who are new to this, is you have to continue to focus on the bottom line. How much resources, how much staff time, how much are you dedicating to your disability inclusion efforts, and what are you getting back? And if the answer is we're getting back a lot less than we're dedicating, that's not going to be, there's not going to be long-term sustainability, right? So one of the first things to think about for long-term success is, are we generating positive ROI? And if we're not, then we have to rethink our project. Okay. Other things that companies would tell you on long-term sustainability include building good partnerships, right? Partnerships with national organizations like vocational rehabilitation at a national level, and being able to work with vocational rehabilitation. Great organizations like Easter Seals, like the ARC, like Goodwill. Those are great national organizations. But then also finding partners on the ground, finding your local community organizations that will help you, partnering with your local community colleges, partnering with your local universities. Partnerships are really key to success of building your disability inclusion initiative. Another key to success is holding the expectations, performance standards as everybody else, right? One of the things we want to be clear on and companies tell you is, if you consciously or kind of subconsciously start reducing your expectations for your employees with disabilities, that will end your initiative or really hurt the long-term sustainability of your efforts, right? hold expectations for everybody the same. Now, like we're going to talk about at the back end, you may train somebody with a disability a little bit differently than you train your neurotypical employees. You may provide a little bit of a different support to some employees, but at the end of the day, performance expectations are held standard. Number 6 is a lot of companies would tell you that to sustain, you need to be loud and proud about your efforts, right? Borrowing lesbian and gay community, that slogan of being proud of becoming a disability-friendly employer, making sure that your internal team is aware of your efforts and making sure the external team is aware of your efforts. Tell your story. Don't overpromise your story to the disability community, but tell your story, and that will help you. That will help you find success. And again, most companies would tell you that from that experience. Number 7, find support from disability experts. Right, a lot of companies who have tried to go the disability inclusion journey alone without a lot of advice from disability experts have struggled. So whether it's finding, there's all kinds of models, whether it's finding some help from your local disability organization, whether it's going to one of those national organizations, whether it's coming to consultants like us, or whether it's hiring. Some companies have gone to actually hiring disability inclusion experts. However you get it, but recommend, and past companies would say, get that advice early. Get those folks who are knowledgeable about the disability community onto your team. Number 8, we kind of hit on this with the applicant tracking systems. The more flexible we can be in our recruiting, hiring, and training systems, typically the better it's going to be for candidates with disabilities, right? A lot of the applicant tracking systems and a lot of our training systems, the way we train folks, are built to, in essence, sometimes they're not built to do this, but they often screen out people with disabilities, or people with disabilities struggle to learn in an exact manner. So individualizing and try to remain flexible as you look at this talent pool as much as possible. As we said, always evaluating your return on investment, right? That's what goes back up to business case. And then the last thing that companies would tell you from past experiences, prepare for positive culture change. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is, especially again, we work a lot in manufacturing and distribution spaces. Honestly, we go into facilities where the morale is low. And people in these facilities are used to kind of getting along by complaining, or by kind of complaining to each other. And what we have seen is a lot of times when those companies start to hire systematically people with disabilities, there is then that opportunity for what we would call a rally effect, right? So rally effect in quotes. Where a lot of times people, it's not just the people with disabilities who bring that positive attitude, it's the individuals around them who probably have somebody with a disability in their life that rally around those employees. And we often see a shift in that facility's culture towards the positive, which is great, but what we've also learned is that for facilities that have had kind of a negative culture for 5 or 6 years in a row, that can be a change, and the change in the way we think about things and do business. So preparing for positive culture change is one of those things that companies who are experienced would tell you. Okay, all right. So we've kind of talked about the benefits in the business case, but this is a slide, right, that just highlights, again, the whole component of disability inclusion and sustaining your disability inclusion efforts long term. So we know, number one, right, that disability inclusion is good for business, and we expect a high return on investment as we do that, from decrease in turnover, increase incentives, increase in diversity and the way we think about things. A lot of good business expectations. It's been proven to work, right, in multiple industries, from logistics to IT to healthcare to retail. Disability inclusion has been proven to work, but there are still opportunities to be leaders in this space if your company is wanting to take the lead. We also know that for any of the companies on here who are federal contractors, right, there is an emphasis, a renewed emphasis or a new emphasis on 503 compliance, right? Basically making sure that you as a federal contractor or subcontractor are actively recruiting and hiring and promoting people with disabilities. So your strategic efforts will help you with your compliance for the federal government. And then lastly, right, this is all about bridging. Do good business with doing good and being able to do that. The good business has, in my opinion, has to come first, but a lot of what also results is doing good, being a good corporate citizen, being a good community citizen is a part of these efforts as well. Okay. And then as we think about, as you say, okay, so how do I think about my future disability inclusion? What are the pillars? What am I going to build? What am I going to build my disability inclusion program on? And what are to be mindful of on a fairly regular basis? Okay, so on the far left, as we talked about, these are the 4 pillars of disability inclusion that we believe. On the far left is stakeholder buy-in. Right? And what we mean by that is buy-in across your company, but also obtaining buy-in from the disability community in your local communities, but also if you're a large company, getting that buy-in on a nationwide basis, being active in disability community opportunities. A second component of that, a second pillar is financial sustainability, as we said. If this isn't generating positive ROI, it's not going to last. And especially if our economy dips or if we go into a bit of a recession, right, that financial sustainability of your disability inclusion needs to be there. Number 3 is you have to, we believe, have a solid messaging and engagement plan. You want to make sure that you are actively messaging, telling stories, being loud and proud about your efforts, again, both internally and externally. And then at the far right, as we said, partnership, the partnership pillar. If you are able to obtain these 4 pillars, we believe that, and keep an eye on that, we believe your disability inclusion efforts will be sustainable in the long term. When my company thinks about how we build the disability inclusion effort, and we've hit on some of these things, but just wanted to kind of go through. We think about 5 major areas of building your plan, right? If we were to build a plan with you, we would typically build a plan that hits 5 major areas, right? So being able to source employees with disabilities is a key part of your disability inclusion plan. And we've talked to a lot of our company partners lately about the burst, what we call the burst effect. In other words, if your company is just beginning to hire people with disabilities and you make an announcement in one of or a bunch of your local communities, you're probably going to see a burst in candidates who are excited to work for your company, candidates with disabilities, which is great, right? You'll see an increase in candidates with disabilities once you make that announcement. But the challenge is making sure that pipeline of candidates is sustainable, that beyond the burst, we are making sure that your operators are finding good candidates. And that takes some strategic intention. It takes creativity. It takes thinking beyond the traditional disability system these days. So sourcing employees is a key part of the plan. As we said, the second part of your plan, we believe, should be disability training, right? Building training as it relates to disability awareness, as it relates to fear and stigma, and as it relates to building supports on the job for your supervisors and a lot of companies we work with nowadays for your team members as well. Capturing incentives, right? As we talked about, making sure your tax credit, your work opportunity tax credit, the WOTC systems are in place, making sure you're capturing all the on-the-job training dollars that are out there, really important. And then lastly, making sure that you're collaborating with your PR and marketing departments to message this initiative on a loud and proud basis. And at the end of the day, right, as you think about best practices, these are the best practices for disability inclusion long term. This is how your company should win. Right? These should be your expectations of a disability inclusion initiative. And if you are currently engaged in an initiative and you are not meeting those expectations, I think it's time to come back to the table. So those expectations should be an access to qualified employees, right? Decrease in turnover, especially in your high demand positions, really actively addressing your turnover issue. Hopefully decreasing some of your recruiting and training costs by having active support from disability experts and the disability community. Being able to increase those incentives, as we said, to help with the business case. Helping you meet your social responsibility goals. Right, a lot of companies have very specific goals as it relates to their CSR, right, their corporate social responsibility. So from a community, a colleague, and a supplier engagement standpoint, this initiative can have major impact. And then your customers, and whether you're a B2B company, we know many B2B companies who are now telling their business customers that they are actively engaged in disability inclusion and can share best practices as part of kind of the carrot of working with them from a B2B standpoint. Or you're a B2C company where you're looking at that customer pool of people with disabilities, right? 25% of our country, 1 in 4 individuals have a disability. Huge market. It's a huge brand loyal customer market, and one that no company should be ignoring. So from all these perspectives, hopefully that you are setting your disability inclusion project up for success. Okay. We'll go to, and as we said, the structure, we'll go to, I see a couple questions popping up in the box. We'll go to about 1:10, till about 3:10 Eastern time. We'll go to about 2:45 Eastern time, because we end at 3 o'clock Eastern, my apologies. So we'll give about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. But right now I want to talk about section 2, which is what we call natural supports. And for a very long time in the history of disability employment, we have depended on what we call job coaches, right? Individuals from community-based agencies to support job seekers and employees with disabilities within companies. And I think job coaches can be a very important support. So it's not that I'm saying all job coaching or job coaches are bad. But from a perspective, again, reminding what our definition of disability inclusion is. And that is company-owned disability efforts. So we don't want, at the end of the day, your supervisors, your managers, depending on a coach, an outside coach, to make every decision for your employees, right? We want to build those supports naturally. We want to help employees with disabilities succeed long-term in your atmosphere, in your environment, without the need of too many external supports. So from that perspective, we're going to talk. And one of the things, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, and specifically working with job coaches. But one of the things that we are seeing more and more in our industry is the good organizations that are out there providing support to companies. Their job coaches will act as consultants to your company, right? The job coaches will actually help you build these natural support techniques that we're going to talk about instead of taking over, right? We don't want job coaches to be the trainer of a person with a disability. We don't want job coaches to be the supervisor, right? That's what your company does, right? That's what you are, the trainer. You are the supervisor, right? Our job coaches are there to help support the individuals with disabilities and support you when that need comes up, okay? So let's talk about natural supports and how we build on-the-job supports for people with disabilities that are natural to your company. So the good folks from Indiana University, and I'm sitting here in wonderful Monticello, Indiana, one of my favorite people, some of my favorite people, Teresa Grassi and David Nank and Becky Banks, have defined natural supports this way, right? Natural supports approaches emphasize integrating individuals with disabilities into the workplace culture in ways that are natural and typical, rather than accentuating limitations of individuals and supporting individuals with specialized assistance from a professional, right? So two things here we're focusing on when we talk about natural supports. Number one, we're talking about enhancing strengths. Yes, we want to build accommodations and build supports if a person has a particular limitation, but we're talking about enhancing that employee's. And number two, so a strength-based model. And number two, we're talking about building the expertise within your company to build these supports. Because one of the things that I'm hoping you'll say at the end of the webinar as we go through some of these natural support ideas is, wow, this is actually more alike than different, right? These are things we already do at our company. We may just need to amp them up a little bit or put them on a little bit of a higher plane, but these are things we're already doing. So hopefully more alike than different as we support workers with disabilities. So let's talk a couple key ideas in terms of what natural supports are. And so the first kind of natural support that we believe is really critical to long-term success of many employees with disabilities in your workplace are the use of visuals, right? And a lot of times in a lot of these natural supports that we are going to be talking about over the next 15 minutes or so are actively focused on those individuals with invisible disabilities that you have in your company currently or that you will be employing as you do more hiring of people with disabilities. So those invisible disabilities, right? And what research shows is that now approximately 70% of the disability community are people with hidden disabilities, disabilities that you can't see, right? I'm an individual with a physical disability. I'm in the minority, right? But there's so many individuals that are already in your workforce and will be in your workforce who have those hidden disabilities like autism, like learning disabilities, like ADHD, like mental health issues, like other emotional disorders, other issues that are typically, again, not visible as you employ folks, right? So when we think about this high number of folks with hidden disabilities, these natural supports are especially impactful. So the first thing as we talk about is many, not all, but many folks with those types of hidden disabilities are visual learners, right? They don't learn best through their ears. They learn best through their eyes. So the more visual that we can make our workplace, the higher the chance for success. And one of the things, if any of you have ever seen or heard Temple Grandin, right? Temple Grandin, Grandin, Temple didn't speak. She talks a lot about how in our American workplace, it's actually the person who's more of a verbal learner, who learns through their ears, that's who has the advantage, because she points to the fact that a job interview, right? When you have a job interview, a traditional job interview is 15 questions, back and forth, right? And typically it's the verbal learner who has the advantage. Even if, you know, qualifications are about the same, it's the verbal learner who's probably going to perform better in that job interview situation and get that job. And then when you think about onboarding and training, even though many of you out there probably have a training manual that you use, a visual manual, I'm willing to bet that a lot of times when your trainers are doing their on-the-job talking a lot of your new employees through what they need to do. Let me talk you through this. I'm going to talk you through. And again, what we're seeing is that is often not the best way to train visual learners, right? So we want to implement as many visuals as we can, not just sitting on a shelf, but active in the workplace. So things like schedules, right? Visual schedules, having access to task checklists, right? Whether it's on technology or in the environments that I work in a lot in distribution and manufacturing, there are boards or sheets or clipboards that show checklists of what needs to be done on that given day for that worker. All different kinds of job aids, work systems. For those of you in industry, right, when we think about lean, right, lean manufacturing, truly what lean manufacturing is the systematic use of creating efficiencies, often by building visuals in the workplace, by using signs on how to lift properly, or lines on the floor to make sure people stay within a given walking path, right? All those visuals are useful for the workforce as a whole, but they're incredibly useful to sustaining success for individuals with hidden disabilities, right? And then beyond that, also using, sometimes folks with autism, sometimes folks with other hidden disabilities also benefit from little written cues, or what we call social stories, that help them not just do the hard skills of the job, but help them understand the social rules of the workplace, right? That help them understand the specific social do's and don'ts of a workplace, because sometimes workers with hidden disabilities struggle more with the soft skills than they do with the hard skills. So you thinking about and going back to your own workplace and saying, how visual is it? For a visual learner, how difficult will it be for them to for them to onboard, for them to train in our environment? Do we do a lot of over-talking, right, and being able to think about that? Okay. All right, let's talk about a couple other natural support ideas. Silence, right? Silence is a really important tool, and people always say, well, silence, how can silence be a natural support idea? Or how can silence be a powerful tool? But again, if you think about those visual learners, and I'm going to give you an example that has always stuck with me. When I was in graduate school and I was doing a research project back in early 2000s in the Chicago suburban area, I was working on a project to help students with autism transition to college or transition to the world of work. And I'll never forget, one student with autism came in and we were doing an exit interview with him from that project. And he said, you know, I really appreciate everything that was done for me in this project, but it still didn't stop me from feeling like the stupidest kid in this high school. And we were all taken back, right? And this is a kid, I think he actually has gone on to get his master's degree in engineering at the University of Illinois. He's working for a major company. He's been really successful. And he was taking like community college math courses by his sophomore year in high school. So we said, stupidest kid in high school, how could you feel like that? And he said, well, and he had done some research to understand. And he said, well, because I'm an incredibly visual learner, right? When I walked into a classroom, right, and I'd go into a classroom, and if there was nothing up on the board, no visual up on the board, agenda in front of me, we would, and then the teacher would ask me a question, a simple question like, what's square root of 64? He says, if I have that on the sheet of paper in front of me, I solve that in a millisecond, right? But because I am a visual learner and it wasn't written in front of me, I have to go through the process of, okay, taking square root 64, turning those words into pictures in my mind, solving the solving that problem in pictures in my mind, and then turning that answer back into words and outputting that to the teacher. And he said with no visual, something like that may take me 4 to 5 seconds. And then he asked us, do you know how long in our typical American workplace or a typical American classroom, how long teachers or supervisors wait for a response after they ask a question? And what he said was, right, that research shows that when we ask our employee or we ask a student a question, we typically only wait a second to a second and a half for the response. And then he said, okay, so I would be in classroom, I would be processing square root 64. A second and a half of time would go by, and then the teacher, what would the teacher do? Well, the teacher, hearing that I was still silent, hearing that I wasn't giving the answer, instead of staying silent, would repeat the question, but maybe with a little more oomph this time. The teacher would say, John, I said, what's the square root of 64? Right? But he said, as a visual learner, right, and as the slide said, what did that do to me? It just restarted my processing loop, right? It restarted the loop. So all of a sudden, I had to go back to start the processing after that second verbal cue. And then he said, after a second and a half would go by, the step is the teacher would then go on and call on another student. And he said, I had developed the self-advocacy skills to tell every one of my teachers that I needed in writing. So his point, Temple Grandin's point, our company is busy a lot, and there's so much in our work environments, but if we can use the power of silence, right? When we ask one of our employees a question, whether it's in a job interview, a training situation, or a performance evaluation situation, if we can ask the question and sit silent instead of 1 second, maybe 4, maybe 5 seconds, right? I'm not asking you to sit silent for 20 seconds, right? But for 4 or 5 seconds, silence can be a hugely powerful tool. And I have to tell you, what I see is on the floors of manufacturers, on the floors of distributors, in retail, in so many industries, what I see is supervisors over-talking to their employees, overwhelming their visual learners by talking too much, by asking a question and then restating it, right? So the more we can help our supervisors and managers understand the power of silence for all our visual learners, right? Not just people with disabilities, the more accessible and the more kind of sustainable our workplace will be. Okay. One other major tip, and then we'll go into some other thoughts and other examples of natural supports. Another key idea that we believe is critical is this list on your slide are what I believe are the 3 major self-advocacy skills that anybody, but particularly a person with a disability needs to have to be successful in your work environment, right? They need to be able to know who and how to ask for help. They need to be able to communicate to their supervisor, I don't understand what you just said. They need to be able to request a break if they're needing it and getting stressed out. Those 3 self-advocacy skills are super critical, right, to the long-term success of your inclusion initiative. And I'm going to focus on, just for a second, on the concept of help. A lot of times we're seeing individuals with hidden disabilities who have come up through our educational system. Again, those folks with autism or ADHD or learning disabilities, incredibly bright individuals, going to make great workers for your company. But they may not always have the highest social self-confidence, right? They may not been the ones that describe themselves as having a ton of friends or being more outgoing because they struggle with some of those thoughts. And so for a lot of individuals in that category, one of the other things that they struggle to do is ask for help on a regular basis. Because, right, at its core, what does asking for help mean? It means I'm coming to you and saying, I don't know something, or I can't do this. And for a lot of individuals who struggle with social self-confidence, that's a hard thing to do. So what we have are these wonderful individual, these students that are coming through elementary, middle school, high school, who if they developed a technique to actively ask for help when they need it, they would be A and B students. But because they don't often ask for help and just kind of muddle through, right, they're C or D students, but they still get through and they're still great candidates for your company. And now they get to your company and this individual employee does not know how or who to ask for help, right? And in a workplace culture, that's incredibly difficult. So one of the things that we do is we work with on-the-ground supervisors to build what we call a culture of help, right? A culture of help. And it's not as big as it sounds, right? It's just really two things that your supervisors and managers can do. Number one, they can reinforce the heck out of people in their department asking for help. In other words, when somebody asks that supervisor for help, again, whether it's that employee with a disability or anybody, if the supervisor reinforces that, thank you for asking for help. That's why I'm here, right? Whether the individual with disability will see that help is welcomed here, help is encouraged here, and it's okay to ask for help, right? So number one is reinforcing help. The second thing that supervisors or managers can do is, from a help perspective, is step in when they know a person is struggling, or when they see, especially during training, that a person is at a place where they're not sure what to do next, so they're just kind of making it up, right? That's the time for the supervisor to come over and say, do you need help, right? Remember, I'm here if you need help. I don't want you to sit and struggle. If you need something, if you're having a difficulty with something, come to me, right? So reinforcing help and stepping in when needed are two ways that supervisors and managers can create that culture of help in their own department, and again, and create this environment where people with hidden disabilities, and all people, right, all their employees are able to feel more free to request the assistance they need. So I asked you those three concepts that we went through, and we're going to go through a few other concepts. But when you think about accessibility, right? When you think about accessibility, and again, especially if you're new to the disability community, when you think about accessibility, you think about things like, typically we think about things like curb cuts, right, for physical accessibility. When you think about automatic doors to get into your building, you think about ramps that have been developed, right? And when you think about those three examples of physical accessibility, automatic doors, curb cuts, and ramps, right? Yes, they have made your company, your facility, and public facilities more accessible to people with disabilities. But they've also just made everything more accessible, right? Curb cuts are good not just for people who use wheelchairs, but they're good for strollers and skateboards and scooters, right? And automatic doors, how many of us find those automatic doors helpful if we're carrying something or if we're walking behind people or whatever? So those physical accessibility pieces have increased, right, increased our world of physical accessibility. Now, your company, in my opinion, needs to start thinking about the invisible accessibility for people with invisible disabilities, and being able to use visuals, number one, think about the power of silence, number 2, and create a culture of help. Those 3 things, if you just take those 3 things away from this webinar and go look at those 3 things in your workplace culture, that is the ramp, the automatic door, and the curb cut, except for people with hidden disabilities, those 3 things. So again, thinking really important about making accommodations and building those supports for long-term success. Okay, let's go through just a couple other, as we kind of wind down, let's go through a couple other more specific examples of natural supports. Again, a lot for folks with hidden disabilities, but can cover folks with all disabilities, and I think generally many of your employees. So other examples of natural supports, right? Being able to build a clear line of management for an individual. A lot of times people with invisible disabilities will want to know who their go-to person, right? And in certain environments, that's easy. There's only one manager, one supervisor. But in some environments, there are multiple, there's assistant managers and department managers and different. But being able to help that person understand, if I really have a problem, my go-to person is X, right? And if X is absent today, my go-to person is Y. We're trying to build that clear line of management for folks with hidden disabilities. We talked about checklists and timetables, right? Great stuff to have. I bet everybody has, or most of the people on this call, you have a to-do list, right, on either whether it's a paper to-do list and you're old school, or you use an app that is a to-do app, right? All of us have our own checklists and timetables. Helping the person with an invisible disability build that checklist can be really beneficial to their kind of day-to-day work routine. One of the other things that we talk about is initial close supervision. And what we mean by initial support is that a lot of times people with hidden disabilities especially will tend to build work routines. An employee with autism, for example, may start building their work routine and how they do their job from the second they walk into your workplace. And so as they are building their routines related to their work tasks and to their social performance in the job, we're hoping that you as a supervisor or your supervisors on the floor give that person frequent supervision, meaning if they're in a good work routine, perfect. Give them that reinforcement, let them know they're doing well. But if they're in a bad work routine and they're not doing something well, or they've been trained poorly, let's stop that routine as soon as we can. Because again, if a person with autism or a person with learning disability is working now in a bad work routine, and they've been allowed to do that routine for a couple of weeks, it may be very difficult to kind of break that routine, not because the person wants to be a difficult employee, but just because they depend on that routine for their own success, but they haven't been trained right. So as much initial close supervision as we can give, and what I think a lot of supervisors would tell you from a long term, if I give a person with a hidden disability or a person with a disability a little bit more upfront supervision and get them into those good work routines, it's going to pay off for me in the back end of this, right? Because I'm going to have a great employee who's going to stick with me for a very long time, right? So initial close supervision. Being very explicit about the rules of behavior, right? One of the things that Temple Grandin talks about are the sins of the system, right? The sins of the system, those informal rules that will get somebody with a hidden disability in trouble, right? I know many folks with autism, for example, who have the actual workplace handbook memorized. They know the rules better than the supervisor on the ground. But again, it's those informal rules that tend to get them in trouble, like their supervisor is going through a divorce and everybody is talking about it, but everybody knows, right? Everybody knows when that supervisor comes in the department, stop talking about that divorce, except that employee with autism who keeps talking about it and gets in trouble, right? Not understanding those unwritten rules, trying to make those unwritten rules more explicit is a way to build social support for many people with hidden disabilities. Consistency from colleagues, right? A lot of times, individuals with certain types of disabilities, especially, again, those hidden disabilities, may want to do some education for their colleagues on what autism is, or what dyslexia is, or what a learning disability is. And so that will also, those type of informal training sessions can also help those colleagues understand that the more consistent we can be with our coworkers with disabilities, the more they will feel supported. Okay. Couple other kind of more specific ideas on natural supports, right? Being able to, as much as possible, gradually introduce a worker with a disability into the work situation, right? Sometimes we see people with disabilities get overwhelmed because, holy, on the first day, my company tried to train me on the 15 things I need to do, right? And I'm just overwhelmed and I break down and I'm not really liking this job, right? So as much as we can, being able to, for example, teach task 1 on day 1, right, and helping that person build that skill to fluency, and task 2 on day 2. So I know it's not always possible because of our training programs, but the more we can separate the tasks and build that gradual introduction, the more successful employees with disabilities are going to be. Making sure that the job tasks are clear and specific, right, and those tasks can be made clear to that employee. And in complete honesty, one of the things that we see on a pretty regular basis is, especially in manufacturing and distribution settings, are supervisors out on the floor who don't know how to do specific tasks themselves, right? They're either new to that department, they've been promoted, or they haven't done kind of the on-the-ground work in a while. So although they may be doing the training, they're not really fluent in how to do the tasks, right? So a lot of times we suggest using a mentor or somebody who's doing those tasks on a daily basis to train that individual, making sure those initial tasks are clear to the employee. Using diagrams, using pictures, we've talked about that, hit on that, right, the key of visuals. Using a structured work pattern. Multitasking can often be difficult for some with hidden disabilities, right? And in today's world, sometimes you just have to multitask. And it's not that people with hidden disabilities can't, but the more we can, again, help one task start and end and then move on to the next, the more efficient many individuals with disabilities will be. A couple other things that we really wanted to hit on when we think about, again, your company building and owning its own supports. Immediate, clear, open feedback, right? And when my team goes around the country and is looking at building workplace supports within companies, one of the things that we notice and one of the things that we hear in honest moments from supervisors, many, not all, but many supervisors, is I'm not sure I want to give an employee who I know has a disability critical feedback, right? Haven't they been through enough? Okay. And again, for those of us who have been in disability inclusion a long time, you may say, "Wow, that statement is ridiculous." But for somebody who's new to working with somebody with disability, they may be unsure, they may lack confidence, they may still feel kind of from a charity mode related to that individual, and so we have to be intentional around making sure that supervisors understand, and we do this in our disability awareness training, is that people with disabilities need both positive and critical feedback, constructive feedback, as much or more than their counterparts, right? So as Temple Grandin, again, would say, if I'm doing something wrong, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Don't couch it. Don't worry too much about my feelings. You don't want to be mean, but let me know what I'm doing wrong, or even more importantly, show me wrong, right? Because that's the next bullet point down, a couple down, is being able to model tasks, right? And if I said on the upfront, I believe those three things related to natural supports are super important: visuals, silence, and culture of help. But if I could pick a fourth, I would say using modeling. In other words, right, again, mostly for our visual learners, if a person is struggling to learn a task, stop talking to them and show them, right? If they're not doing something right, just maybe stop the words and do it. Allow them to see it, and then do it again and allow them to see it again. So modeling a task, and so again, clear feedback, and then being able to show a person if they're struggling what is doing wrong, okay? A couple other bullet points on this slide, making sure colleagues have guidelines. Again, that can often come through informal or formal training. A lot of times when colleagues are understanding that there is a disability initiative happening, not necessarily that this individual or this individual has a disability, but it is a general effort, I think a lot of times they can bring that to a personal reference and understand some of the things that could be supportive, but providing those guidelines. And then one of the things that the last bullet point talks about is basically talking to the employee. And again, I know that sounds basic, but a lot of times we see supervisors, when an employee with a disability is struggling, they may brainstorm with other supervisors on how to solve the problem, or they may go to the job coach and brainstorm on how to fix this problem. But at the end of the day, it's that employee with a disability who probably knows the answer on how to make it better, right? So the first question should be, if you're struggling, if the employee is struggling with work speed, the question, have you ever struggled with speed at work before? And if so, what'd you do? Or did you ever struggle with doing your speed of doing your schoolwork at school? If so, what'd you do, right? So being able, part of natural supports is making sure that the employee with the disability is the active participant in developing those supports. Okay, I said as we would wrap down here, we would also talk a little bit about job coaches, right? So for those organizations on the phone, the community organizations that are providing services, and for you companies that are on this webinar or going to listen to this webinar, I wanted to, we emphasize natural supports and supports that are owned by the company. It's not that we don't believe in the use of job coaches, it's actually just the counter, that I think job coaches can be incredibly important in helping a company, especially a company that's new to hiring people with disabilities, build those natural supports. But what we're hoping is that, and for you companies out there, what we hope is you set the expectation that your job coaches that you're working with, you set the expectation that those coaches are your consultant. Right? They aren't going to be the pseudo or step-in trainer. They're not going to be the pseudo or step-in supervisor. They are your consultant working with the trainer, working with the supervisor, and working with everybody else, the team that supports that individual as a consultant to what does a consultant do? They assess the problem. They put strategies in place, and then they get out, right? And that's what we hope that job coaches will mostly do, is they will be there to support the individual, but they're not there to take over. And so from that end, right, job coaches we expect to work as a team member to provide those natural supports, to help create those natural supports. As we said, they're there to problem solve and support the onboarding and training, but they're not there to take over. And there's the list, the last part of this slide is the list of things that a job coach can support a supervisor, right, and be a great resource to a supervisor related to safety skills and speed and quality of work, workplace behaviors, and social skills. All those things, a job coach can be a great resource. We want to make sure, just as a company, we don't put our job coaches in the space that they are taking over training or supervising. Okay. All right. And then lastly, as we conclude, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to any questions, the last two slides are just descriptive of what we call a natural supports library, or the development of an NSL, natural supports library. And what we believe a natural supports library is, and it can be as easy as building an Excel spreadsheet, but what we believe is a natural supports library is built within your company, right? It's an easy reference tool for managers to learn what supports have already been used in similar situations in your company, right? So in other words, we are capturing those ideas, as the bullet point talks about, capturing ideas and strategies that have been used to support employees with disabilities, and we think about it as a give-get tool. In other words, if we were able to help an individual improve their work quality with a certain visual, or improve their work speed with certain types of coaching or mentoring, right, from a colleague, we would want to document those strategies, those support strategies, in the natural supports library so that other supervisors, other managers can learn, and we can all be better as we catalog those ideas, and we don't have to recreate the wheel, right? Now, it's important to remember that when you're building a natural supports library, that you document those ideas and those strategies by position and performance issue, right? Never attaching an individual name, right? We cannot, from confidentiality and ADA standpoint, attach an individual's name. But what we can do is document the position that the person is working in, what their performance issue was, and then the third category is what the support was used. And again, the focus of a natural supports library is, so a new manager starts and they are supervising a couple individuals with disabilities, and they want to build the natural support, but they're not sure where to start. They can go right to the natural supports library and see if there have other ideas that other managers have used in your company. It's a give-get tool. And again, what I would say is, and I'm hoping you're realizing this, that I now see supervisors using it not just for their employees with disabilities, but just any employee who's struggling to get some ideas on how to improve performance. Right. And then lastly, this is just a slide that shows the example of a natural supports library and how you may just simply document it. And again, it can be as easy as an Excel. So the first example is the position was a picker in the Walgreens distribution center. The performance issue was that person was unable to remember how to deal with what's called exceptions, right? So they were picking product off the line. An exception is if a bottle was broken, or a label was ripped, or something was torn, and there could be 13 or 14 different exceptions. The person was having a difficult time remembering what to do with given exceptions, and that was the stress over this was affecting that person's overall productivity. So we created a key ring with all the exceptions listed on in a picture, and then just a couple steps on that key ring, excuse me, on how to deal with that exception. And actually one that ended up happening in that distribution center was that key ring was not just used for that individual with a disability, it ended up being used for everybody, because turns out, again, everybody was struggling to memorize how to deal with exceptions. Okay, so that's an example. Another example was the position was customer service associate at a Best Buy store. The individual was having difficulty helping customers find departments other than his own. He was helping out, and he was an individual in the computer department. So the natural support developed was he reviewed the store map every day, every morning before he started his shift, and he kept a visual of the store map in his pocket for easy reference. So that was his natural support that was used to help customers find other departments. Excuse me. And then lastly, a truck loader at UPS was having difficulty figuring out patterns to make sure that the truck was packed properly so items didn't fall. So the natural support there was they were paired with an experienced loader who mentored the individual for several shifts on how to build the wall, how to build that wall of packages, and how to deal with certain situations. So these are examples of kind of simplistically documenting the position, the performance issue, and the natural support so that everybody can learn, again, and from a company-owned perspective, we are supporting people with disabilities as we move through. Okay, so This is my contact information. If there are questions or issues that have come up that you either don't want to or don't have time to share on this call, feel free to contact me via email. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have or at least get you to a resource that can. But for now, I will open it up to either questions in the chat room or questions that we have from the team, from everybody on the webinar.
Thank you, James, for this enlightening presentation. Operator, could you tell everyone in the chat room how to ask questions of us today?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. If you have any questions, you can use the chat window on the lower left side of your screen. And I see you have some questions over there also. So, thank you.
Okay, so I see a few about downloading the materials from this event, from this webinar. You can stay tuned to our social media. We will have the video of this webinar along with a PowerPoint and a PDF version of the slides up shortly, so stay tuned on that. Do you know if the people from Walgreens ever companies? There's another question.
So yes. Actually, I think if you don't, one of the most powerful tools that I use to help other companies kind of get the Walgreens feel is you go to YouTube and you put in Randy Lewis Walgreens. Again, that's Randy Lewis from Walgreens, and Randy was the head of distribution, and he has these amazing talks about the business case and what they did. But I know that Walgreens still gives regular tours of their distribution centers, both in Anderson, South Carolina, and Hartford, Connecticut, to any companies in doing this. So, if anybody wants a tour, any companies want a tour, and want to know how to get that tour of one of those facilities, they can just shoot me an email.
We have a question. How do you handle it when a supervisor has coworkers who state things like, "I am not for a supervisor, it's not my problem," when you are trying to help an employer find a natural support for your client in the workplace? Not that I would suggest a coworker like that to be the one who should be a natural support.
Let me try to get that. Let me try to get that one again. Sorry. Is that in the chat box? Can you repeat that question?
Sure. Sorry. How do you handle when a supervisor has coworkers who state things like, "I am not for a supervisor, it's not my problem"?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's going to happen, right? I think one of the things that we try to do is locate mentors who are going to, intentionally find somebody who maybe has, being able to find a coworker who has a relative with a disability or who has a particular passion. We do that through informal training. We do that through kind of searching out mentors. Not everybody is going to want to help, right? And not everybody in that workforce is going to want to help, is going to want to be a mentor, is going to want to take that extra time. So sometimes it takes that kind of strategic searching out. Sometimes it takes that, that individual employee hopefully disclosing and being comfortable with doing a little bit of a department training to then we find that mentor. But again, yeah, finding that one mentor. If there's 5 people, maybe 4 don't want to help, but maybe there's that one person that really wants to be able to take the time.
What are work systems?
So work systems are kind of other examples of the visuals we've been using. So for example, having a work system, maybe if somebody is on a production line, having a red card or a stop sign at the end of whatever their tasks are, or having a green symbol at the beginning of their tasks, or using different baskets to file different labels or different tables. So work systems are visual systems that are used to support the workflow.
Okay, so I'm actually going to read a question from Philip, who is not here today. He had a family emergency, so we wish him the best. What are your thoughts on structuring the accommodations process?
So when we think about for the companies when we think about your official accommodation process, right? When we think about your official reasonable accommodation process, number one, it's important that you have a strong, written policy for reasonable accommodations, right? So that's number one. Number two, and many companies miss this step, is it's important that you train your workforce on that reasonable accommodation policy, right? Because especially if you're a federal contractor, one of the things that the government is going to want to know from your workers is, if they need an accommodation, do they know what to do, right? It's a good start to have a policy on reasonable accommodations, but you also need to be able to train your workers on what that policy is if they need, or what the process is if they need an accommodation. And then lastly, a strong reasonable accommodation process is built in the interactive process, right? I think a lot of companies who are scared of making an accommodation often lean to the answer is no right away, where if you kind of flip that and say, figure out how we can make this accommodation and how can we make it reasonable and how can we interact with our employees, those are the companies that have been successful in the process.
Okay, one more question from Philip, and then I'm going to double check and make sure we're stuffing else. Any thoughts on how to run a successful self-identification campaign in the business?
Yeah, so I think it's really important when we think about self-identification for those companies that are federal contractors, is as we're asking people, right, as we're asking and surveying people who have disabilities, we want to make sure that we understand that those individuals in our workforce understand what's in it for me, right? Why should I disclose to you on a form that I have a disability, right? What is in it for me? And a lot of that starts with not just putting a survey right in front of our workers and asking them to self-identify, right, and self-disclose, right? What we want to do is, as Philip's suggesting, build a self-identification campaign that is informative. Maybe we use some media, maybe we use some video. There are a couple great companies like CSX Transportation who have built internal campaigns to let all their employees know that they value their employees with disabilities, that they want their people with disabilities to come forward, to be leaders, to describe their experience. And so as we think about trying to get more and more people in your company to disclose, it's not just about putting a survey in front of folks. It's about messaging, and it's about building a strong and intentional campaign to let people know that disability is valued in your workplace culture.
Okay, so I'm going to read one more question from the chat that was sent by Jessica, and it's a good question. Do you have any best practice suggestions when initiating a conversation with an employer about the benefits of hiring an individual with a disability?
Yeah, so hopefully, again, I would say that a lot of those things that we talked about in the beginning, right, the fact that especially in this labor market, all the companies that we talk to, right, that we start with the fact of finding what their labor need is, right? They're struggling to find good workers, right? And the employing one or employing multiple people with disabilities, especially in this tight labor market, is a huge benefit to so many companies. And I'll be honest that 3 or 4 years ago, companies that wouldn't talk to us as consultants are now calling us back because they are really needing a strategy to find workers to be able to that stay in their jobs, right? That stay around. And so I think leading with the fact that workers with disabilities are going to be with your company, they're going to be brand loyal, they're going to be 100%. I think that is the key strategy. And then other things like the incentives or other things like the partnering and being able to build an inclusive environment come along with that. But nowadays, until this unemployment rate changes, leading with "I have a solution to your labor problem," for me is the most effective strategy.
And on that note, I want to say one more thank you to James Emmett for speaking and leading this webinar for us. You can find James's contact information on the last slide. We have 3 more webinars coming up this month for NDEAM. Join us next week for a great conversation with Jim Sinocci of JP Morgan and Vincenzo Piscopo of Coca-Cola. You can find out more and RSVP for any of our webinars at our website, respectability.org. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.